Hi, my name is Safiatou Sankara, and I'm going to be presenting the police-involved shooting of Sean Elijah Bell. So Sean Elijah Bell was born in Queens, New York on May 18th, 1983. His parents' names were Valerie and William Bell. According to his loved ones, he dreamed of acting and becoming an electrician. Sean was a baseball player and a fiance. He was engaged to be married to Nicole Poutier. They had two beautiful daughters named Jada and Jordan Bell, and their wedding date was set for November 25th, 2006. You can see some photos of Sean and his family at the bottom. Some facts about the shooting is Sean Bell was at a club in Queens celebrating his bachelor party the night before his wedding. After the festivities, Bell and his two friends, Joseph Guzman and Trent Benefield, sat in a car, and five clothed police officers approached them. The officers claimed they heard one of the gentlemen say, "Yo, get my gun," when they were standing outside, so they followed them and opened fire on the car. The officers fired 50 rounds. Bell was struck 4 times in the neck and in the torso from the driver's seat. His friend Joseph was shot 19 times, and Benefield was shot 3 times from the back seat. Out of the three, Bell was the only one who died. Benefield and Guzman was severely wounded. The officers involved in the shooting claimed there was a fourth gentleman in a car who had a weapon, but he ran out and fired shots their way. After investigating, collecting witness statements, and looking at ballistic evidence, it was determined that these statements from the officers were not true. Sean Elijah Bell was killed on the day of his wedding. My thoughts on the shooting is that I think the police used an excessive amount of force in this situation. According to the people in the victim witness statements, there was no justifiable reason for the officers opening fire on the three guys in the car. To justify the officers' action, there needed to be an act of aggression from someone. For an example, charging an officer, resisting arrest, not complying with orders, reaching for a weapon, or the officers tried lower levels of force, and the only option left was to resort to deadly force. None of these examples were the case. According to the witness account, the officers did not even identify themselves to the gentleman before opening fire. There was no excuse to escalate to using deadly force. Based on federal policy, one or some of the following elements must be present when using deadly force. Defense of life, a suspect is fleeing, the officers issued verbal warnings, warning shots were fired, or the officer believes that the driver or a passenger in the vehicle is an imminent threat to themselves or of officers. When using deadly force in a car, the officers must also make sure that their actions do not put other civilians in danger. In the shooting of Bell, Guzman, and Benefield, the federal elements of force were not present, and the actions the officers took to put the lives of the public in danger. When they were firing at the car, a bullet almost struck a person standing in front of the Jamaica Air train station. In this situation, many things could have been done differently. First, if the officers suspected them of carrying a weapon, they could have identified themselves as officers, performed an overclothing search on a gentleman, and determined whether they had a gun. Second, the officers could have utilized one of the 6 other levels of force before deadly force, if the gentlemen were not compliant or being aggressive. Lastly, they shouldn't have fired 50 rounds into an unmoving car filled with 3 unarmed people. It was just excessive. What factors may have contributed to the training and overall subculture of the police force in question? One would be the dehumanization of minorities and people who live in predominantly urban areas by law enforcement is a contributing factor to this. Officers tend to target people of color and react as if they're guilty even before they get to assess the situation. When dealing with law enforcement, people of color are not given the same courtesies as their white counterparts. In the shooting of Bell, Guzman, and Benefield, the officers did not even give them a chance to prove that they were not guilty of carrying a weapon. The officers made assumptions because of how they looked, and they did not provide them with the benefit of doubt. The officers reacted with actions that seemed like they had the intent to kill the gentleman. Two would be the lack of proper de-escalation tactics and training, which contributes to the subculture of police force. Law enforcement officers are not properly equipped with the tools needed to engage with civilians in a manner where physical force is not the end goal. Officers do not receive enough training to remedy situations where they are protecting both their lives and civilians. Many steps should have been taken before having to use deadly force is ever applied. Also, before an officer discharges their weapon, it should be clear whether the civilian or suspect possessing one or is actually a threat to them. Three would be the lack of accountability and repercussions that also fuels the police force because they know they'll get away with it. Because of the culture of protecting one's own instead of reprimanding an officer who is at fault for doing something wrong, there tends to be silence from other law enforcement officers, or they're defending them and trying to justify their actions. It's not common to see an officer who was accused of using excessive force and they're fired or charged with a crime. Instead, they get placed on paid leave or they're moved to another post within the department. This makes it seem like their actions are okay and will go unanswered. Four would be the mentality of us versus them, which fuels the subculture of police force. Because of this mentality, instead of protecting citizens you vow to keep safe, it's like you see them as a threat and you view them as outsiders instead of members of your community. It seems like if you're not a part of their boys club, your life isn't valued as much. Instead of viewing civilians as an outsider who is against them, it will be better to understand everyone is an individual, a part of the community whose life should be valued as much as a fellow officer. Some hiring changes I would make for a safer community is that law enforcement officers should be required to have a degree in either psychology, sociology, or social work. This would allow them to be better equipped to understand people, deal with people in tough situations, and have more knowledge on how to approach situations where hard choices need to be made. Second would be all police cadets would be required to do an extensive psychological evaluation. This will not only be done when they're becoming an officer, but they'll be required to pass a psych evaluation yearly. This is important because police officers are in a dangerous environment and they deal with violent situations and just hard and traumatic situations in general. So it's better to evaluate them and make sure they're okay or treat anything that needs to be treated instead of just letting them be on the streets. Third, lastly, would be that police officers should go through sensitivity training before they begin working and periodically throughout the years. Law enforcement officials deal with people from all walks of life. They should be equipped to understand the differences amongst those people and have the forethought not to label certain people simply because of their appearance or background. The death of Sean Bell was the first time that I experienced how enraging it is to see someone's life taken away senselessly by the police. Growing up, I will always hear stories about Amadou Diallo and how he was killed for no reason. But it kind of seemed like something I was far removed from my life because I was so young at the time, so I didn't understand. Sean Bell's death shifted how I viewed or interacted with the police officers. They were no longer the heroes to me. I realized that they could be the villains. Sean Bell's death was the first time I participated in a march calling for justice. This shooting created a view in me that most people around me already had, which was that the police do not like you or people who look like you. Witnessing the uproar of Bell's death also created a great fear in me because I had three older brothers who looked just like him. It made me afraid they could be next. My perception of the law definitely changed because of this shooting, because now the police to me were bad guys and people I should watch out for. They wasn't like the fun people who came to my school or like hung around the neighborhood anymore to me. I adopted a view that a lot of people around me had, which was that police officers were thugs in uniform. My current view of police has evolved a little bit because I understand a little more about what goes into being an officer. But to me, there's still not people that I don't think is necessarily trustworthy. It's always like us versus them. It's been 18 years since the killing of Bell, and officers are still involved in the killings of civilians. It seems like they never learn and they still don't value the lives of people of color. So I think the purpose of this assignment was to analyze a police involved shooting and see what could have been done better, not only in that particular situation, but throughout law enforcement in general. Though I don't want to be a police officer, I think this assignment also gives an understanding on one of the worst aspects of the job for those who do want to enter the field. This assignment also let me see how preventable Sean Bell's death actually was. All it would have taken was some training and a little less bias from the police officers, and he could still be alive today. Also, it shows how there needs to be more requirements, education, and training that goes into being a police officer. Now, these are some pictures of Sean Bell and his family. You can see his two daughters who graduated in 2020. You can see pictures of his wife, and you can see him. Now, the end. Bye.